I like Toby Fox's music. Starting with a real banger of a hot take. But to me and many others, it wasn't just that his music is good, it's that it was like the first time we ever heard of leitmotifs, right? These shared musical traits between multiple songs that get to represent an entire idea or character. Like, is about Rule's card because it's the same as... It's genius. To me, motifs have always been fun, not only from a listener's side, where I get to recognize these patterns and satisfy my monkey brain, but even in my own hobby of music. You're saying I get to reuse things that I made that are already good, and it enhances the meaning and clarity of my story? Sign me up. But this means in the landscape of Deltarune, leitmotifs are seen as pretty important, like a major pillar of Toby Fox's storytelling, given just as much weight as visual or textual evidence when theorizing about the story. Like a simple do-do-do-do of 4 notes means the WDG is afoot. And that's fun, but is the fact that a couple songs made by the same guy sound similar really enough to figure out that the Roaring Night is Asgore or whatever? Why do we think that? Obviously, leitmotifs weren't a concept invented by Toby Fox. They've always been a part of storytelling. But Undertale was notable and popularized the technique because... it wasn't very subtle about it. Hopes and Dreams does not lightly allude to a motif that secretly represents Undertale as a whole. You notice it. And for many, these songs can tell the story through leitmotifs alone, drawing connections between major characters and themes. For an obvious example, let's not beat around the bush, Asgore, the song, not the man in the bush, does this excellently. This is our fight with the King of the Underground, who's deeply linked with many other monsters, and the song alludes to this by reusing motifs from all over the game. There's a large section referencing Toriel's theme to symbolize how close the two used to be. Asgore's motif is even specifically not in Toriel's battle theme, representing the one-sided nature of Asgore's lingering divorce energy. Asgore's song also includes part of Undyne's theme, representing how important he was to her growth and development as the captain of the Royal Guard, though Asgore's motif is, again, not present in Undyne's. Undyne still respects him, though, so this isn't really the same case as Toriel, but the fact that Asgore's motif isn't really present in the Underground at all shows us just how disconnected he truly is from his kingdom. You only hear his motif in the game over sequence when he's directly speaking, and in this one cutscene of people snoring, which we can probably disregard. Other major examples include the Ghost motif for all the Ghost characters, with Ghost Fight, Dummy, and Mad Mew Mew. Or there's the incredibly important Asriel motif, which even shows us that not all motif usages need to just reinforce what we already know. Sometimes they can hint at new things, like with his theme showing up in Finale. Which is a strictly Flowey boss fight song before we could even know that Flowey was Asriel. This is all why analyzing motif choices is such a major part of predicting Deltarune. Songs like Asgore seem to go out of their way to include the motifs of all relevant connections, and it seems like any inclusion of a motif would reasonably imply something worth paying attention to. But we did just have to completely ignore a song with Asgore's motif to make our point. Yeah, it's a joke song, but it still brings the question... No. The best example of meaningful motif usage comes from the end of the game, when it makes perfect sense for these music choices to matter the most. It's like any anime remixing the opening theme for the credits song of the season finale. But we're not at the end of Deltarune, we're just past the middle, where in Undertale, motifs were used a lot more loosely. The obvious example is the earlier ghost motif being used in Spider Dance. Maybe you could argue the motif is more of just a spooky things motif, or maybe Muffet just wasn't important enough to get her own song. But Papyrus certainly was, and yet Dating Start and Dating Fight use the motif of Snowdin instead of the much more fitting Papyrus motif. And Dating Tense is essentially just a remix of the song Undine. Not even removing the explicit Undine motif from it. Is Dating Tense referencing Undine intentionally because Papyrus is getting more serious and that invokes his serious training with Undine? Or is it just because Undine's theme is tense, so it fits the tone? Or like, does Confession use the Snowdin motif because Undine actually forced those two royal guards to secretly train in Snowdin for a time and that's where the gay love first sparked? Probably not. But those are all unimportant songs, so it makes sense for them to use motifs haphazardly. But then, why does an important song like Hopes and Dreams include Snowdin's motif when it doesn't even include Azriel's theme at all? Why does it keep being Snowdin? Well, I'll tell you why. The song isn't about Azriel, it's about Undertale. Its main component is the Undertale motif, which, while mixed with Azriel's theme in the titular song Undertale, and being used instead of Azriel's theme for all of his boss music, is a separate motif. However, it's still critical that they're linked because the story of Undertale is, in essence, the story of Azriel. That means that this fight against him isn't just a fight against an undead child, but a fight about Undertale entirely. That's why Snowdin is here. Not because it's relevant to Azriel, but because Snowdin is pretty much the only major settlement of monsters that we actually experience, where we actually get to see the normal lives of these monsters and interact with them. It's the heart of why we care about the underground. It's a really good use of motifs for storytelling. Unfortunately, that kind of splashes back with Flowey's theme being present, making less sense because that is more specific to Azriel than Undertale as a whole, but functionally, it still works. We don't need to get caught up in the semantics here. How you communicate something isn't as important as whether or not the message got across. And I think that's what Undertale intends for its use of leitmotifs. You could still have meaningful motifs in meaningless songs, as long as people still understand its meaning when it really matters. Like, Here We Are uses Alfie's motif. Majorly distorted and disfigured in a form of symbolism that perfectly reflects the nature of the True Lab and its relationship to Alfie's as a character. It's meaningful. But this random bird uses a much more direct quote of Alfie's motif despite having no relationship to anything connected to her. It's meaningless. And yet, when we hear Undine playing this motif on the piano, we know it's because of Alfie's, and not just Undine paying tribute to a local bird. See, this works because there's really only emphasis put on specific songs having a motif, so you only notice and care about the ones that matter. In fact, I bet most people didn't even realize that this part of Undine's theme is used so freely. Yeah, okay, this one makes sense, it's Undine and Waterfall, but actually this took from the Ruins. And Ruins gets remixed for the ending theme. I'm sure if you got an Undine-centric neutral ending, you might have noticed this. Or if you killed Undine in the neutral route, it plays there too. But you notice it because those are both Undine scenarios. Otherwise, there's not much of a reason to even be thinking about Undine here. Though my favorite part of this is that it means battle against a true hero, shares a motif with ruins. Which I just think is funny. Of course, this does mean that every use of a motif is only as important as it actually is, not as important as it could be. And that works fine in Undertale when there's no room to misinterpret things. The whole game's there already. But to finally wrap this back around to Deltarune, I'm sure you can imagine that it causes a lot more issues with an incomplete game that has a fan base desperate to find any connections to everything. Black Knife is the boss theme of the Roaring Night. The text in Deltarune gives us no info on them, and visuals give us very little, outside of it likely being a deer, and having something that you could argue is probably linked to that one guy who is probably linked to everything. But many people think Black Knife can fill in what words and appearance fail to tell us by analyzing its leitmotifs. Though I bring it up first because, like it or not, there's nothing here. It's obvious why so many people expect there to be important motifs in here, and equally obvious why people claim that there actually are, but it just isn't true. The only motif in Black Knife is this one. Which is also used here. It's a motif that's so obviously just been leading up to this that it's kind of just the Black Knife motif, or if you're slightly more bold, the Knight's theme. But that doesn't stop people from trying to find some secret reference to who the Knight really is in this. In fact, the entire reason I started thinking about this stuff at all was because I saw a Papyrus Knight theory video that pointed out that Black Knife includes dating tense from Undertale. And I'll be honest, it sounds shockingly convincing, but if you remember from earlier, dating tense is just Undyne's theme, so if anything, it's a link to Undyne. But luckily, it isn't even that, because if I just play each song in a less conveniently cut fashion, you can barely even tell what was supposed to be the motif in the first place. Cutting an arbitrary collection of notes out of a larger melody doesn't really prove much. However, some also propose that Asriel is the Roaring Knight, and that the start of Black Knife is actually similar to Burn in Despair. Except you're not hearing a motif, you're hearing drums. Well, not even that. You're just hearing a snare hitting on every other beat, which is like one of the most common ways to do drums. The actual motif of Burn in Despair is just Your Best Nightmare, and that melody isn't present at the start of Black Knife at all. So like, this just isn't a connection. Oh, but maybe it isn't just Black Knife. After all, Carol could be the Knight, and her theme song sounds like breathing, which perfectly lines up with the song titled Breath that plays when the Knight first appears. But they don't actually sound similar at all, and the breathing sound in Carol's theme is just slowed down sleigh bells. And as it turns out, I know most people in the trenches of Knight theory warfare don't want to hear this, but Lost Girl is actually the closest to being in Black Knife. Just swapping two notes at this part makes it practically identical to part of Lost Girl, but is modifying the notes to match just a portion of a full motif enough to convince you? Maybe not. I mean, you can do the exact same thing with The Legend to turn it into Lost Girl, which... But there's just so much room for doubt when it comes to big connections like this. At least Lost Girl is a complex, full melody, so you can change some parts of it without losing the whole reference, but deciding how much of the motif is enough to be convincing without any evidence outside of the music is tough. Especially since, like all other motifs, most quotes of Lost Girl still maintain quite a bit of obviousness. Everyone listening to the currently unused but eventually going to be used, maybe with a different title, song, Sneaking, noticed its use of the Lost Girl motif. In fact, let's take a brief tangent to talk about how, even if Lost Girl was in Black Knife verbatim, it might not even matter. This is one of the few cases where Toby Fox directly acknowledged that a theme tied to a specific idea will be used in many places disconnected from it. Lost Girl just keeps being used in scenes for its somber tone without any link to deaths. This would sometimes happen in Undertale with songs like Sans' theme showing up in Grillby's and Napstabluke's Snail Farm, but that's a goofy, chill theme showing up in goofy, chill areas. Lost Girl is an important song being used in important scenes that it doesn't quite make sense for, which almost makes it hard to actually pin down its intended meaning. You could argue that the scattering of the song is intentional to reflect how Dess's influence is spread across the whole game, but maybe it's just intentional in the way the 52 pickup is. Throwing the theme around is fun for the person doing it, who knows the purpose of doing so, but cleaning it up is kind of just hard if you don't know what the deck looked like. Most of Girl Next Door is that motif, and most appearances of the motif are tied to the holidays, if not Noel specifically, so you can argue for it representing her instead of Des. So even if Lost Girl was in Black Knife, there'd be such a mess of debatability that we still probably couldn't be 100% confident that Des was the knight. But that brings us back around to the main weirdo at hand, where beyond just having hallucinated motifs that aren't there, Black Knife has one notable absence that's just so painfully absent that people can't even pretend it's in the song. Black Knife is a boss theme for a character who gives us a shadow crystal, and yet it does not contain the freedom motif heard in all other shadow crystal boss themes. Even Garson, a character who has nothing in common with Spamton nor Jevil outside of just being within close proximity to a shadow crystal, does have the motif, so why doesn't the knight, who is also near a shadow crystal? Is the motif only for characters tied to the concept of freedom, and the shadow crystals are just a coincidental common thread? Or was it just excluded from Black Knife to mask the fact that this is how you get the shadow crystal in Chapter 3? The link to freedom seems like a more compelling explanation, but it bumps into the issue that the freedom motif itself is Gaster's theme, and the knight, more than any other shadow crystal holder, seems very closely linked to Gaster. So honestly, I'd expect it to be here even without the shadow crystal connection. But I will admit, the entire concept of the freedom motif isn't that obvious to normal players, especially at the end of Chapter 3 where its only uses have been Spamton essentially just referencing back to Jevil and nothing else. As I mentioned with Undertale, the king rule here is to make sure the audience understands the purpose of the motif more than using it correctly. So not only would the freedom motif being in Black Knife spoil the twist of the fight, it also probably just confuse people, especially when it's so hard to even notice the Gaster part of this motif, because honestly, Gaster's theme is a bit of a mess to identify. Gaster's theme is an arpeggio of 4 notes with 3 unique tones. But that doesn't really matter for what I'm doing here. Instead, just know that it looks like this, most distinctly characterized by having 2 notes on the bottom, and then a gap of 6 empty tones between that and the top note. The big issue with Gaster's theme is twofold. One, it's just 4 notes. That makes it hard to be sure that any reference to it is intentional, but this also means that the references we can feel are intentional have to be almost identical to the original notes, otherwise it'd be impossible to tell it apart from any 4 random notes. 2, Gaster is just a guy. Like, yeah, he's important, but we know so little about him and his connections that it's hard for any actual textual or visual connection to seem deliberate. A flimsy motif plus at best circumstantial external support means that every example of Gaster's motif is questionable, but meaningfully meaningless. Let's skip all the well-established examples of Gaster's motif and jump straight into the best example of what I mean by this. Scarlet Forest has an exact sequence of 4 notes that follow the pattern of Gaster's theme, and it's sandwiched between repeats of similar 4-note patterns. It's not exactly repeating the same thing over and over, but variation is natural for a real song, so for any other motif this would be plenty, but it's so easy to just accidentally have this sequence of 4 notes, and there's no obvious reason for Gaster to be referenced here, so it's hard to be sure if this is intentional or not. But even if it is, that just means we've stepped into being meaningfully meaningless. Gaster is an important character we know very little about, so if he really is connected to the Scarlet Forest, then that's meaningful. It's a big new piece of evidence about him. But how? With so little to go on for Gaster and no supporting evidence outside of the music, we just have to assume it aligns with one of the few things we already know about him. Like, entry 17 is likely about Gaster discovering Dark Worlds, so Scarlet Forest quotes Gaster's theme because it's a dark world. This gives nothing new, and we can't safely speculate beyond that because this is such a weak foundation already, so ultimately, it's meaningless. And this issue carries into the Freedom motif. The Freedom motif is a fan name for this melody from The World Revolving. It's not obviously Gaster's theme just by listening to it, or even by looking at it, so it could be easy to write off the 6-note gap, which would be the only distinguishing feature here. However, its repeated use of going back and forth between the 2 notes who are next to each other, and the only occasional jump up specifically with that 6-note gap, just like Gaster's theme, is about as strong as we can get. And unlike most Gaster hallucinations, there's some decently believable supporting evidence. Like, that's a quote from the one thing he ever said, or that might be a sound, which is usually associated with him, which, not stellar evidence, but as far as Gaster motifs go, quite believable. It's also not hard to construct a narrative in your head linking Gaster's role as a narrator and potential controlling entity of Deltarune to the concept of freedom that the bosses with this motif represent. But like I said, it maintains that Gastery issue. It doesn't tell us anything new in the cases where we are confident about it. Javelin Spampton may be connected to Gaster was already a conclusion without the freedom motif being considered. It's not all doom though. Another hymn is clearly Gaster's theme, and that is actually a significant piece of evidence to connect the voice in the intro to Gaster. Similarly, Darkness Falls has a slightly less, but still pretty obvious Gaster's theme opening, and the same voice from the start of the game talks to us there. It's pretty cut and dry, except what's this icky, moist part still left uncut? Sorry. The second half of Darkness Falls is a melody with nothing particularly Gastery to it, and Chapter 2 even adds an additional game over theme with this same motif completely removed from Gaster. As per usual, our lack of Gaster solids leaves our interpretation of this quite liquid. We can't connect this new motif to Gaster because we know nothing about what it means in relation to him. Though going a little bit outside of sound, the direct audio file of Faint Courage has the same all-caps audio prefix as Another Hymn and Darkness Falls do, which would link it all to Gaster. Not that it would even matter because it gives us no new info. Are you catching on to how this is just a classic dilemma with Gaster-related music? Although there's one Gaster that's stranger than the rest. Noelle. Girl Next Door may be largely comprised of Lost Girl, but Noelle does have her own motif, separate from Des. It's a part of Girl Next Door that isn't present in Lost Girl, and shows up entirely on its own in Gingerbread House, and this Noelle motif, well... yeah, it opens on what now seems like a pretty blatant Gasterism. This doesn't seem accidental either, because later in the song it references Gaster's theme again in a different way. This is during the Lost Girl portion of the song, but since Lost Girl itself doesn't actually do the Gaster repetition like this, it feels more deliberately like a Noelle specialty. And there's nothing else. This is, at least to me, an actual case where a motif is being used for potential foreshadowing that we haven't seen paid off yet, but because it's Gaster foreshadowing, that could mean an infinite amount of things. And I suspect we won't get a solid idea on what it actually is until it's already obvious enough through other supporting evidence. Or it's all completely coincidental and has nothing to do with Noelle. That's what's so tiring and annoying about trying to work with Gaster's theme. But thankfully, there are actual real motifs that are important to Deltarune already, which are much easier and much more satisfying to find. Don't forget, it's important to Deltarune. That's pretty obvious, right? It's the main theme, so it's everywhere. Though this also means that there's a lot of cases where it doesn't really mean anything, which isn't too surprising. Undertale's main theme was used for some meaningful moments at the end of the game, but it still showed up in a random hotel. However, there's actually an interesting aspect of Undertale's main theme that I pointed out earlier that I think happened with Don't Forget too. Much like how the song Undertale linked its main theme with Asriel to represent how important Asriel is to Undertale's meaning, Raise Up Your Bat imposes the lyrics of Don't Forget over the top of Lost Girl. This suggests that Don't Forget and Deltarune as a whole is closely tied with the story of Des. Maybe Don't Forget is sung from the perspective of Des. I don't know, it's interesting. Though the most interesting thing I noticed was actually this. This is all the songs with Don't Forget in it. And, you know, just by playing the game, I kind of realized that it was most prominent in chapters 1 and 4, but it's kind of crazy to realize that it basically entirely disappears during the middle of the game. Well, the middle from what we have right now. Technically, chapter 4 is the middle of the game. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the motif cooled down again for chapters 5 and 6, just to come back in full force at the end of the game. Why? Because that's what happened with Undertale's main theme. This distribution kinda just makes sense from a storytelling standpoint. You introduce the story hard at the start, remind us of the stakes in the middle, and then pay it all off in the end. This actually explains why Hotel has the main theme in it. It's because Hotel was roughly the middle point of Undertale. Yep, that's right. Me bringing up Hotel multiple times was actually a Chekhov's motif. Although, notably, the legend does this too, which also makes a bit of sense because the prophecy is basically the overall story of Deltarune, so these two motifs will likely show up hand in hand, following the distribution that Undertale's main theme did. Of course, this isn't a hard set rule, but it is a pattern, and Deltarune fans love patterns. Though, now that I mention it, it's a little weird that Don't Forget and the legend overlap so often. Like, they're different motifs, right? They should represent different things. Well, starting in chapter 1, the legend is most clearly repeated in Castletown's theme. And then later it reappears in Chaos King. But it really shines in Chapter 4, where it is undeniably used to represent the prophecy as a whole. And you could argue that making a separate motif from Don't Forget helps keep this more focused on just being about the prophecy, but even this one has some weirdness to it. Like, there's 3 parts to the legend, and they're all seemingly used for different things. There's this first rising melody that seems to be the most specific to the prophecy, since it's the main part referenced in the sanctuary themes. There's this middle part, which is the part I said could be turned into Lost Girl if you want to stretch it that way, though this also seems more like Rousey-y. I don't know about this one. It's just more common in the Castletown themes than it is in any other song referencing the legend. And then this final falling melody is the only part that Chaos King references, and is never referenced by any other songs besides Castletown, which makes it very rare and very specific. It's hard to come to any definitive conclusions, but at least the legend does have some potential meaning that doesn't overlap with Don't Forget, though there's something else that is competing for space with the legend. Its sequel cutscene, The Dark Truth, which introduces a brand new leitmotif connected to the prophecy. And sticking a single name to this motif is a little tough, because it goes a lot further than you might think. Mainly because it's just 3 notes like Gaster's theme, so it's kind of easy to stretch it if we want. Well, it's kind of 6 notes because the repeat with the last note being higher is important. Whatever, let's just call it the Stupid Everything motif so we can move forward. The Stupid Everything motif returns in Chapter 4 like the other prophecy-related motifs, but here it's a lot more modest, only being used in Dark Place, Never-Ending Night, and 12 a.m. Well, okay, the higher note on this one doesn't go as high as it needs to. In fact, Hometown matches better if that's what you're judging by. But none of that matters, because I think there's a more important theme that's closer than both of them. On its own, that's not too convincing, but a variation of this in Versus Susie matches more exactly, though admittedly only the first half of it. And together, those two make a very convincing argument, but that's not the only one I have. Buckle up, because here's when I justify the name of this motif. Now, hold on, I know those basically aren't even notes. We're kinda just in audio hallucination territory with this, but I think it's safe to assume that bit roots would have the same notes as digital roots, and those are actually recognizable notes. Obviously, it's still not a perfect match or anything. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine that the songs about darkness, the roaring, and the prophecy could in some way share a motif with the dark basements where you carry out actions that defy the prophecy. But I'll admit that the connection musically is a bit of a stretch. However, if we accept that one for now, this is how they get you with scams, by the way, we could stretch it even further, because not only is it for the roaring, for Roots, and for Susie, but I also think it's... And this is where it all comes together. The Holy seemingly references both our original Dark Truth melody and the stretchier Roots melody. It's not a flawless connection by any means. I mean, it's closer to Gaster's theme at some points. But regardless, I think we could say this is truly a stupid everything motif. Which, now that we're here, I guess a more appropriate name would have been the Darkness motif. Dark Truth, Dark Place, Dark Fountain, Dark Place. But unfortunately, the only interesting thing to come of this tenuous connection is to Susie's theme. The implications of a major prophecy-related motif, specifically one pertaining to endings and/or darkness, being present in Susie's theme is probably a bad sign for her, but the conclusion of Susie might be bad for the prophecy, or defy it, or somehow be connected to the end of it is all just vague stuff we kind of already suspected. And ultimately, roping in so many other songs just based on 3 notes is a lot, arguably too much. In fact, I even originally had more to say about the falling melody of the legend before realizing that that one was too much, or as some may say, it was just wrong. When I first listened to the soundtrack to try to notice some motif tidbits, I thought Rude Buster had that melody in it. but when I went to get the notes to show that they were the same, well, they clearly weren't. My stretches with the darkness motif don't seem nearly as bad now, do they? But this wasn't the only one like this, because while for the most part I was flying solo on noticing motifs in various songs, when the Deltarune wiki has a carefully maintained page on leitmotifs, it's hard to resist checking my work. And under the section for the legend, they had a song listed that Oh, never mind, they removed it. It used to claim that Dark Zone had the Falling Legend melody in it, and I was going to point out how that one was so wrong that there was actually a different part of the legend that matched better, but whatever. The point that I'm getting at is that it's easy to trick yourself into hearing a motif that isn't there, and that makes it hard to argue for any motif that isn't extremely obvious. Not to mention that Jackenstein's theme references the legend, or Susie's theme might hint at her defying the prophecy in some way, are not exciting new conclusions. You can certainly justify these motifs being intentional in your head, but when it doesn't even lead to any interesting new conclusions, what's the point in arguing it? I guess that's going about it all wrong. Toby Fox doesn't use motifs as lore reveals, they're just supposed to enhance what we already know. And I think there's no better showcase of this than how Deltarune handles its Undertale motifs. These three characters have one thing in common: the ghost motif. And they each use this for different reasons that I think perfectly show off all the different ways Undertale motifs are used in Deltarune. Napstablook has the ghost motif through the chill alarm beat they play in Chapter 2. This motif usage makes perfect sense and is incredibly straightforward. In Undertale, it was largely associated with Napstablook, so it's being associated with them again, just because it's still the same character. Funnily enough, it's pretty much the only example of this type of usage outside of Tenna's dialogue playing snippets of Undertale songs. But it's pretty safe to assume that the main point in using a motif from Undertale for the Undertale character who had it originally is just consistency. Spamton has the ghost motif through Big Shot, directly quoting part of Dummy, which is still a very fitting use. Part of it is because Spamton is currently occupying a body designed by Mettaton, who is a ghost, but why Dummy specifically? Well, it's because Spamton isn't a ghost. He's a puppet, a dummy. It's a perfect use of the motif to tie Spamton Neo to relevant characters from Undertale, and comment on the nature of his story in a subtle way by relating it to Undertale. Another great example of this type of usage is just like all of Gerson's stuff. Gerson's songs largely use Undyne's motif because in Undertale she looked up to and modeled herself off of Gerson. This one's interesting though because Deltarune Gerson likely doesn't have any direct connections to Deltarune Undyne, but it still tells us something about Gerson through the way he references Undyne's motif. Undyne's theme hits you with a punch in the face at the start of each beat, reflecting her personality. However, Gerson's version of it deliberately skips the starting beat, softening it and telling us through music how he differs in personality from her. As for the last ghost motif, it's also here. Let's be honest, this is just a jazzy song for Toriel and Sans to dance to. There's no connection to Napstablook here. But that's because the point wasn't to tie this moment to Napstablook. It was to use an existing motif to fit a tone, and enhance that tone by using our familiarity with Undertale. The most obvious example would be the place where it rained that was literally right before this, which I'm sure I don't need to elaborate on, but the contrast from a song with an emotional impact and deeper meaning for Undertale fans to a deliberately goofy song that almost spits in your face for taking the moment seriously is intentional. I think an even better example is Hometown reusing the Snowdin motif. Like with Hopes and Dreams, this melody represents a familiar domestic settlement of monsters, a home, but it also gains the new power of being a nostalgic melody to us now, giving Hometown a perfect melancholy comfort that plants us in a similar mindset to Chris without wasting time getting us there. This is home, but things are different from what we're used to. Not necessarily worse, but different. This also happens with You Can Always Come Home, using our nostalgia of home from Undertale for a similar effect. making Chris's house feel comfortable, familiar, and safe even though we just got here. So if those are the ways that Deltarune uses Undertale motifs, then what's this? That's Battle Against a True Hero. Why does Burning Eyes reference True Hero? That's like the one Undertale motif I couldn't figure out until I realized that this motif is actually shared with Amalgam in Undertale. Meaning this isn't a specific True Hero motif, it's more of a shared theme for monsters living past death due to determination, which could have major implications when applied here in Deltarune, especially when combined with the fact that Friend, who also shows up in this fight, is shown in the shape of the Amalgamate Endogeny. But now we've just wrapped back around to the same issue as Susie having the Darkness motif. Wasn't this already an idea even without the motif? We've wrapped back around to the issues with Gaster's theme. Does this even matter for the story? We're back at the issues with Black Knife. Is this quote even intentional? Are motifs? No, obviously not. I keep circling back to the same idea. Toby Fox's use of motifs is not really keeping in line with usual practice for this method of storytelling. Lancer's theme is the main component of Acid Tunnel of Love, Sword uses Tenna's motif despite being the untented version of the game, Glowing Snow is a remix of the Settings menu from Undertale, Friends is mainly Noelle's motif despite this being the only time in the entire Chapter 4 Light World segment where Noelle is not here. Like, come on, Jingle Bells is associated with Noelle more often than her own theme. For many, it's hard to predict or theorize about Deltarune when the motifs feel like they mean nothing, but that doesn't mean that they do mean nothing. It just means we're thinking about them too much. The logic when you examine a motif doesn't matter against the emotion when you experience it and realize what it meant in the moment. Deltarune's motifs are still meaningful when they should be. Look, I like music, I like thinking about music, and I think some of the ways Toby Fox reuses themes across different songs is fun. It's directly inspired my approach to music. And I don't mean that you should just ignore motifs entirely. I had a couple motif-based predictions in this video, and I'm not gonna act like I don't partially believe in them. But it's important to know how and why motifs are used throughout Toby Fox's work, and know that figuring out the intention of a motif is oftentimes more important than identifying that a motif is there, because like, if the knight was Papyrus, he wouldn't tell us this by using dating tense. Come on, guys!